and we'll get started. So nice to see all of you. And I do these sessions occasionally, this last one for a bit, to just sort of share what coaching is and have people get a chance to see what it's like. And for many of you have coached with me and you get your tune-up or you like the topic. And I usually just pick things that have been coming up for people on a regular basis. And so this one, navigating uncertainty with more grace and ease, really came up fairly naturally because I have been navigating a lot of change and uncertainty over the last, probably last year, honestly. And I started to realize that I was really leaning into a lot of certain tools, and I thought it would be really useful to share that process. And I know most of you, and so I will just say that I have been doing this coaching mindfulness retreat work for almost 5 years now, which is crazy. And I really love it and enjoy it. And what I love most about it is watching other people benefit from it. And several of you have made big shifts in your life. And so I know that it works. And many of the things that I'm going to talk about today are actually the secret to this navigating anxiety is bringing together all the tools. We often think I just have to change my mindset, but that actually doesn't work with the anxiety because the anxiety is much more physiologic. And so in medicine, we dislike uncertainty. We are taught that uncertainty is dangerous if we don't know what the problem is, if we don't know what we're going to do next. We like to know the plan. And if we liked uncertainty, we would not have done medicine. We would have gone and worked for a startup, or I know one of you has at least done that, but if we liked it, we would have chosen something else. So people who choose medicine don't like uncertainty, and they generally don't like change. They like a laid out path. Some of us more than others are okay with uncertainty, but nobody in medicine likes it. And so acknowledging straight off the bat that you are not going to like it and uncertainty is not the space that you feel comfortable is really, really helpful. And so recognizing that we don't like it and recognizing that it doesn't feel good is actually some of the most important things we can do as we move forward. And then thinking about the things that we do automatically that get us into trouble. And many of you know what those are, but I'm going to talk about some of them. But if you just think about this sort of default thought that if we don't know, something bad will happen. And we ask ourselves terrible questions when we have uncertainty, like, what if it doesn't work out? What if I was asking myself, not really asking myself, I was really telling myself a story. I was going to be lonely after I dropped my last kid off. I'm not lonely anymore. It's only been 4 days. I'm good. But I had this idea that what if I'm out here in the country and now I'm going to be lonely and what am I going to do? And that's just where our brain goes. And so just to recognize we go to those negative what ifs automatically, and they don't feel good. And if you think about your reaction, I'm thinking back to when I worked at TPMG or Kaiser and we transitioned to Epic. This was like 10 or 15 years ago, right? Everyone was in a tizzy about the change and the uncertainty and how would it work. And if we didn't know how it would work, it was going to be bad. And so just recognizing that is our response to change. Anytime we change the call schedule or the way we handled forms, we would go into that uncertainty. So then when there are things in your life that are even more uncertain, say a child, having an empty nest and having no idea what that's like, moving, changing jobs, having, I have 2 elderly parents who are really not doing well. So I actually check my phone every morning to see if they're still alive. I know that sounds morbid, but I'm very prepared. And I'm just like, oh, good, there's no messages. This is great. But that's daily uncertainty. And so recognizing that that is really part of life. And so how do we want to move through it? Do we want to move through it anxious, or do we want to move through it, I like to say, with grace or elegance or more ease? It is not going to be easy because nobody likes uncertainty. So I divided this intro bit where I will just give you my tips and then we'll do some coaching, or I'll help some of you who may be managing uncertainty, is what you can do that helps and what doesn't help. So the things we want to do less of and the things we want to do more of. So I'm going to start with what helps. And it's really the things that I always talk about. So mindset and mindfulness, okay? And so the mindfulness, the self-compassion, the nourishing yourself well, those of you who've worked with me know that I always start with those three, and then the mindset coaching, because if you are not in a good physiologic space or mindful or slowing down or noticing, you can't make change. If you can't hate yourself into liking uncertainty and just say, like, what's wrong with me? Why am I not okay with it? And we can't manage it well if we are depleted, is what I mean by nourishing yourself well, below empty, which most people in medicine are below empty, just saying. So the mindfulness piece, I'm going to delve into a bit. And the key thing that I see is that most of us don't do it proactively. So we don't practice when we're well. We only do it when we really need to lean into it because something is going on. So if you can practice it so that you can drop in more quickly, that is the most helpful thing. And then because you're really trying to stay out of this reactivity. And if you think about anxiety, it's really a feeling. And the feeling comes from thoughts, but some of it doesn't come from thoughts. Some of it comes just physiologic. It's just there. And so part of mindfulness is managing that, getting yourself in a more calm, more parasympathetic space. So that would be meditating or restorative yoga or putting your feet up the wall or finding what works for you. I will say with my recent anxiety, none of those tools worked. So I always like to be really transparent about it. When I found like I was, my reaction to dropping my youngest off at college was actually anxiety, which is very strange for me, not grief, not sadness. Maybe it was all mixed up, but I actually couldn't sit still. So I have been climbing mountains for the last week. It's great. I've gotten lots of exercise, but I just want to acknowledge that sometimes you can't sit still. And so you can mindfully walk, you can mindfully power walk, you can mindfully climb a mountain. One of the reasons that I got into yoga initially was that I could not be mindful and sit still. I had too much Dr. Angst energy and I just couldn't settle. And so when I could do yoga, I could drop into mindfulness and still move. And that was really helpful for me. So if you're thinking about anxiety as an emotion, it's got a lot of twangy energy. And so sometimes that sitting is really, really hard. And for those of you who've been to a retreat, when you first get there, the sitting is really hard. By the end, you can do it, but in the beginning, it's really hard. And so just acknowledging that anxiety really is going to tip you into that. And then if you think about the tenets of mindfulness, so the first one that applies to anxiety is the acceptance. And for this one, I think it's really accept and allow that there is uncertainty in the world. We hope, we're all fixers, managers, controllers. We really want it to go away, but it doesn't go away. It's just part of life. And when we accept that there are going to be bits and time periods with anxiety, and most of the time they turn out okay, we actually can help it move more quickly. When you trap it and try to make it go away, it actually grows. And so allowing it to be there as uncomfortable as it is and allowing that to be part of life is actually the most important bit that you can bring to it. And that is mindfulness. So accept and allow. You can also accept and not like it for those of you who know that tool. But you have to allow it and you have to accept it. So resisting the reality that there is something out there, there's uncertainty. You don't know. You know, if you are waiting for a test result or you're waiting to hear where your kid gets into college, or you're waiting to see if someone buys your house, for example, all of those things are out of your control. And so really it's how are you going to choose to spend that time while you're waiting? And then pausing and breathing is one of my all-time recommendations. But when you do that, again, you're shifting your physiology. And so part of mindfulness is using your physiology strategically. So pausing and breathing. And in that pause, it's choosing how you want to spend this waiting time or the uncertain time or the time until you know. And so that is where the intention comes in. And intention is one of those tenets of mindfulness. So going back to how do you want to choose to spend it? What is your intention? What energy do you want to bring to it? That's the proactive piece. So in medicine, we just react. We're exceptional reactors, but we're not necessarily proactive, or what I like to say, we're not great responders. We're reactors, but not responders. So if you can respond to this uncertainty and the anxiety strategically with some intention. So it might be, you could decide that you're going to be peaceful about it, you're going to fail. And so you actually have to pick something that's reasonable. So my thought with this uncertainty, a lot of it was like, I'm just going to keep moving. I'm going to flow. I'm going to try not to get stuck. I'm going to try not to swim upstream and resist it. And I'm going to like be in the flow of the river. And for me, that isn't something I can feel instantly in my body, is like, stop the resistance and stop the holding on to the desperateness to know or for it to go faster. And that actually gives you tremendous relief. So choosing that intention, which can be a word, can be a style, you get to pick. And we actually talked in the last Curious About Coaching a lot about intention. So if you want a refresher on that, you can watch it. And then awareness and noticing is one of those other tenets of mindfulness that's super helpful here. So being aware, knowing that you are having a stress response. They say in mindfulness training, name it to tame it. So if you're acknowledging that, wow, I'm anxious about this, or wow, I'm uncomfortable, or I'm not at ease, or sometimes we don't even know the emotion, and many physicians aren't connected to their feelings anymore, but we know we have chest tightness, or we know we have a pit in our stomach, or we know that our heart is racing. So you can identify it that way and then say, what is that coming from? And asking yourself, is it anxiety? Is it fear? Is it grief? Is it disappointment? Is it frustration? Is it anger? Like, we often call it all anxiety, but it actually may not be. And when we react to uncertainty, you really want to be clear, what is it? Are you afraid of what's going to happen? Are you worried? Are you uncomfortable? Because when we have uncertainty, we're always uncomfortable, because at least people in medicine. How's that? And then I mentioned this before, but using your physiology strategically, and that is doing those mindful activities to get yourself into that neurochemical soup that is more responsive and more strategic and more intentional. So you can sit in that liminal space in between and not have so much of a reaction. And so finding whatever it is you can do there, whether it's actual exercise and getting creative with your mindfulness here. So maybe it's forest bathing, maybe it's lying on the grass in the park, maybe it is swimming, maybe it is, could even be something like surfing if you can do that. So it can be exercise, it can be meditating on a mat, finding what you can do. And then a couple of other bits of this mindfulness. And keep in mind, this is all still in that category of mindfulness, which is physiologic. And it's also, what's the word? Philosophic. It's the philosophy. I can't get that part of speech correct. So showing up with curiosity, I think, is really key in this one. Like, I wonder rather than, can you wonder rather than worry? I like the double W's. And so I wonder what's going to happen rather than what if something terrible happens, for example. Patience is one of the other tenets, and most of us are urgent. And so most of our problem with uncertainty is that it hasn't been solved yet. But when I end that word yet, I'm like, oh, that doesn't mean it's not going to be solved. It doesn't mean something terrible is going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. Or it hasn't happened on my timeline, which is usually the case. My timeline is usually unrealistic. The other thing I'll say is that while you are patient and you are anxious and you are uncertain, we tend to buffer with busy or recreate busy or create all these things to do so we don't have to feel the emotion. And that is not necessarily helpful because you're distracting yourself. And I'm going to get into buffering, but just keeping in mind that you want to literally practice patience. And for most of us, patience is really challenging. And so just to acknowledge, I had someone tell me the other day, oh, patience is like a superpower if you can figure it out. And so pause and breathe and decide that you're going to practice patience. We always tell our patients to be patient. We tell our children to be patient, but we are not patient. And so turning it on yourself a little bit. And a few of the other mindfulness ones that are super relevant here are trust. So it will likely turn out better than you expect or not as bad as you think. But that sort of trusting and believing and remembering that we were not taught that in medicine. And then letting go of what's not in your control. And so identifying what's in your control and what's not in your control. And it feels great if you can find a few things that are in your control and focus on them. So maybe things that replete you, maybe how you're going to be mindful, choosing how you're going to wait. And then generosity of thinking is the other one I wanted to bring up. So generosity is a tenet of mindfulness, which is not giving all your stuff away. You're all generous people and helping others. It's thinking positively, telling positive stories, assuming good intent, bringing hope to it. It's possible it will work out okay. So in this generosity of thinking is where I like to park that idea that uncertainty is possibility or it's opportunity. Like when things are certain, you know, perhaps you have a job that you don't like. Uncertainty to a different one, it could be amazing. You just don't know. But we have a trigger to the uncertainty where many of us are afraid of uncertainty. Maybe it's not anxious, but it's fear. And then choosing to pay attention to whatever you choose. So attention is another tenet of mindfulness. So what are you going to pay attention to while you're waiting, while you're sitting in the uncertainty? So paying attention to things that are in your control is helpful. Paying attention to the positive, also helpful, keeps you out of that negativity bias. And so noticing what's going well, noticing what's beautiful, noticing what is certain. They're likely in your life, 85% of the things are pretty certain and 15% are uncertain, but our energy all goes to the uncertain. So focusing on what you do know, what is stable. That perhaps a relationship is stable, but a job is uncertain, or perhaps a job is uncertain, but a relationship is stable, or maybe you're just staying in the same house. Find something that's staying the same. And then, so that's it for the mindfulness category. And I always say, if you don't bring mindfulness to mindset work and coaching, it doesn't work long-term. It works short-term. We can willpower our way into anything. You wouldn't have made it through medicine if you couldn't, but we tend to flip backwards. And so when you practice these things from a mindful state, that is when your brain is really willing to shift and change. If you are in fight or flight, your brain won't shift or change, which makes sense. And so practicing mindfulness, shifting your physiology, getting yourself in the right physiologic state is going to help you navigate however long the period of uncertainty is. And so when I have things going on, I do more exercise, I do more yoga, and particularly for me, yoga, but sometimes more mindfulness, sometimes more forest bathing. You have to find your thing and do more of it. When you have no time to do it is when you need to do more of it. And for some of you, Karen, I'm thinking of this for you, thought downloads, I'm guessing that would be really helpful for you, which is a practice of mindfulness that I didn't mention. So self-compassion is the next one, which is actually part of mindfulness, but I pull it out because most people I work with are terrible at it, which it means being kind to yourself. It means being, I'll just say even just kind. You don't have to love yourself. You don't have to say amazing things about yourself. You just have to not be mean to yourself. And when we practice self-compassion, if we actually practice it, we release oxytocin, which impacts your amygdala in ways that you can respond to problems creatively. And you can respond to uncertainty creatively rather than just going into your default patterns. That's where you can tap into curiosity. And so I always teach hand to heart is what I would say, just tons of hand to heart. And just visualize that oxytocin going everywhere. Feels amazing. So do more of it. As some of you, if you don't like hand to heart, you can also do the loving kindness meditation. I really like physical components of mindfulness. For me, they're grounding. That's why yoga, hand to heart, a lot of the practices that I teach have a physical component rather than just sitting there. And that really depends on you. But if you find that, you can do hand to heart, you can do hand to belly. Notice where, if you have a pit in your stomach with anxiety, put your hands on your belly. If it's in your chest or if it's in your throat, touching there. If your head is super spinny, get a yoga block, particularly a cork one, and put your forehead on it. Put your head down, do a forward fold with a stack of yoga blocks or a chair, and have your forehead pressing on something firm. That is actually helps with anxiety and tremendously. And then the next one is this repletion category. So you can't be on empty, you can't be below empty and navigate uncertainty well. And most of us are below empty. And so noticing those things that replete you, a retreat isn't ultimate repletion, but what can you do at home? Can you eat healthier? Can you sit in the sunshine? Can you listen to good music? Can you wash your sheets? That's a good one. Can you take a hot bath or go for a hike? Do notice the things that do give you energy and do more of those. Those essentially grow your capacity to navigate thoughtfully and intentionally as opposed to reacting to everything. And we are much more reactive when we are in the midst of uncertainty. And then the last part is the mindset tools. So that's the coaching, but the other three are really the prerequisites so that you can work on your mindset strategically. So the ones that I think really apply here that help are asking good questions versus bad questions. So the ones that I came up with are, what will your future self wish you had done now? Will your future self wish you had sat here worrying is the one that I like to, or catastrophizing, or worrying you might be lonely. Well, if you're lonely, great, but why sit here and worry about it, for example, or worry that they won't call you back for an interview. Well, you won't wish when they do that you had sat there worrying or not. And so rather than asking like, what if it turns out badly? What if it turns out okay? What if it's not as bad as I think? What if it's better than I think? Or the other way, if you don't want to ask a question, is just, I have no idea how it's going to turn out. Hands wide open is the mindfulness approach to that. So come up with some good questions you can ask yourself about your situation specifically, and then telling a better story or a more neutral story. So maybe I don't know yet, or this is all part of the process, or it's taking longer than I thought, or I don't know the answer. I like the yet. That for me is really reassuring. I just don't know how it's all going to turn out yet, rather than it's not turning out the way I thought, or it's slower than I thought, or it's never going to work, which is what our brain usually goes to when we're in this uncertainty. And I think thinking about uncertainty as a liminal space, like it's the space in between, it's the shifting from one to the other. And so that in itself is not a problem. It's supposed to be uncomfortable, but we attribute discomfort to a problem in medicine. And so when we're uncomfortable in that liminal, uncertain space, we think there's a problem, and we go into all these default habits about how we might be able to fix it. So the next mindset tool is focus on what's in your control, which I mentioned before. How do you wait? What do you do? What do you not do? What do you say? What do you not say? And the stories you tell. And then, of course, those of you who work with me, the tone and energy with which you tell those stories and you show up. Because you can sometimes fake it, but if you don't have the tone and energy the way you want to show up, perhaps just kind to yourself, or perhaps flexibly, or perhaps, I love the word open to whatever. And maybe you're not totally open, but maybe it's more open, or maybe you want to embrace it. You get to pick depending on what's possible for you. And so I would try to pick something, a tone and energy that is possible. Don't pick something that's all Pollyanna and I'm just going to have fun with this and it's going to be amazing, because you don't believe it. And that is not actually how coaching works. If you do not believe it, it doesn't work. And then staying out of urgency, I think, is really important. And we talked about about being patient. And then the last one that I came up with of things that help is intentional connection and what I call elegant vulnerability. And I think we are trained in medicine to not share. So when we are anxious, we hold it in tight. We don't want anyone to know that we're struggling. We don't want people to know that we don't have it figured out, or that we don't know what our next job is, or we don't know how this is going to work out. And so we tend to keep things inside, and that actually increases the anxiety. And so connecting either in small groups or with a single person or having conversations about it is incredibly helpful in moving through uncertainty. And it's one of the reasons that, retreats and small groups are really helpful, because you understand you're not alone. What I mean by elegant vulnerability, though, is not showing up and just vomiting up all the things that are going on. It's doing it in sort of an elegant, kind way, but it is being vulnerable, because that vulnerability is what creates connection. It creates this safe space. So many people in medicine complain they don't have friends, or they don't have these relationships that they want. And many of that comes from the fact that we were taught not to be vulnerable and not to share and not to reach out. And so finding spaces where that is safe and where you can do that elegantly is a really, really powerful tool. And so thinking about, am I doing it elegantly, and how can I create those spaces? My two very good friends from med school, who both are empty nesters a few years ago, they actually set up a Zoom call for me today. And it was just lovely. And I hadn't thought of it, but one of them suggested it. Well, let's just sit down. And, one is in Boston and one is in LA, so they're nowhere near me. But again, it's that connection and vulnerability, that finding a group of people that you feel safe. And if you don't have one, then creating it. So showing up in a community where that's there. And it's one of the reasons that I do small group retreats. I'm not someone who feels comfortable being vulnerable in a huge ballroom or a big conference center. And so I think finding these pockets that feel really good to you and feel safe in whatever way that is for you. So that's what I think helps. What I think doesn't help, so things you shouldn't do, and then we'll jump into your questions and coaching, is resisting reality. You've all heard me say that. If you're resisting the reality of some uncertainty, like I should know by now, or in my case, we had this snafu in selling my other house, and I very much resisted reality. They should have done it better. They should have done it faster, all the things. Now it's sold and it's fine, but I was upset, right? I was resisting the reality of the timeline and what other people had done. And that's a waste of time because you can't change it. And so recognizing where you might be resisting reality, or that the uncertainty should be solved, for example. And then buffering, I wanted to bring up, because what buffering means is you do things in the moment to feel better that harm you in the long term. So drinking, eating chocolate, scrolling on Facebook, they don't all harm you in the long term, but in excessive amounts they do. Shopping, TV, surfing the internet, we do these things because they release dopamine and we feel good, but they don't help us solve the problem. And so noticing, where you might be doing that, or you might be doing it to excess, and figuring out what could you do instead. So if you are buffering with, ice cream, could you have a really delicious dinner? Or could you make some amazing dessert? I'm not suggesting you not have dessert, but make it amazing and have a little bit and make it a thing, like the process of making it. Or thinking about those things that I mentioned that actually replete you and actually feel good. So release dopamine in healthier ways if possible. So exercise does that. Yoga does that. Talking to a friend does that. Clean sheets can do that. Fresh flowers can do that. And so just start thinking of other ways to feel better rather than buffering. And I will give a caveat for many of you. People also buffer with overwork. And some people in medicine buffer with over-exercising. So it feels good, but they're really just doing it to not feel the emotions. And when you allow that anxiety, which I mentioned, and allow the uncertainty and let it feel not so great, it moves. Whereas if you try to stop it and buffer, it doesn't move, it just stays. And so finding ways and tools to let it move safely. So if it's really triggering, or you have a background of, trauma, working with someone on how to move it elegantly and safely is really important. You don't just want to let it go wild, but if you can even move it in little bits, and it's a very powerful tool. So what else doesn't work is catastrophizing, focusing on the negative, regret. So I should have done it this way, or it shouldn't, shouldn't be in this uncertain situation. Reacting rather than responding, victimhood, which we're all experts at, scarcity mindset. So, when we're in uncertainty, if there's only one way out, that's very scarce. Whereas if there are 7 different ways, 7 different options that could work out okay, you feel a lot less anxious. And then all or none, or right or wrong, we tend to think there's a right way to get out of this, or a right way for it to end. And so again, there are many right ways. And our doctor brain really makes things black and white. We were taught, there's a practice guidelines, there's a right way to follow. And we judge our colleagues too. Did they do it the right way, or did the patients do the right thing? And that leads to a lot more anxiety in the face of uncertainty. And so just recognizing that there are a zillion right ways, and there's lots of gray in between that black and white, can be really, really helpful. So those are the tips that I had for this uncertainty. I do want to offer that it's really hard to do it on your own. And even I find it really hard to do it all on your own, because when you're anxious, that's the time that we default back to all our old habits. And so just acknowledging with hand to heart, like, this is hard. It's getting help definitely helps. And I have gotten lots of help over the years. And I think that connection and vulnerability piece is very helpful. So don't beat yourself up over it if you are struggling with it, because that's the opposite of self-compassion and is going to actually get in the way of you feeling better. So finding a space that feels safe to work through it, and a person to work through it with, or a group of people to work through it with, can be incredibly helpful. And most of us choose not to do that, because when we feel anxious, we don't want everyone else to know how anxious we feel, or that we're struggling, if that makes sense. So I'm going to stop talking there and let you all ask your questions, or if you want some coaching, I'm happy to jump into that. Anybody have questions, thoughts? Karen, do you? I don't know. I'm drawn to your box, so maybe you do.
Yeah, I do. I don't know if I've quite, this is helpful. I mean, just this reminder and grounding, and this is really helpful. I'm just, yeah, I don't have any particular questions. I can step back and let people ask questions if they have questions, but
Okay.
I won't go into my thing yet.
Yeah. Anybody else have